Okay, part 3 of lettering. Now, I briefly went over the auto kerning in part 2, but I just wanted to demonstrate so you do understand what it does. So this font, which is the London font, and I've put it in at 15 millimeters height, which is the smallest that they recommend for that font. Um, you can see here between the W and the O, the space is a little bit big. That's because each letter has a ball, like an edge, and because the W leans out this way, the edge is a little bit too far away from the bottom of the W, and so the O looks like it's too far across. So this is a kerning issue. That's what kerning means. So if we put a checkbox in the auto kerning, we can then hit apply, and you'll see that the O moved closer into the W. So that font has kerning built into it. If nothing happens, it means the font doesn't have kerning built into it. Another place where you might find a problem is if you're using small lettering, not this particular font because it's quite big, but if you were using a smaller lettering, you may find the spaces between the L's are too tight. Now, if your kerning doesn't work or your font doesn't have kerning built into it, then you can use some of the lettering editing tools. So I'm going to move on to the letter editing tools now, to manually fix things you're not happy with. So I'm just going to take that auto kerning off and go OK. So let's spread that out again. Now I've got my lettering selected, and I can now go to the reshape tool because that's where you do the editing. So if I click on the reshape tool, we get all sorts of nodes and things that we can use to change the shape of this. Now, as I said, it is still one object. So all of this will behave as one object, but you can adjust it. So if I zoom in here to the word world, you can see each letter has a pink diamond in the middle of it. And you can select each letter individually, and that gives you even more tools to operate that letter individually as opposed to the whole word. And so you can then drag that O with that node a little bit closer. Of course, you will then have to drag all the other letters a little bit closer too. But it does allow you to space your letters if your kerning doesn't work. Okay, now this can also be useful if you're using a random path for you instead of having a baseline. If you a straight baseline, if your baseline was random, so let's try that. So I'll go back to select and go back to the object properties, and I'm going to now choose the digitize any shape. Now, of course, as I said in the last video, we have to so I'm going to click off so nothing's selected and choose the digitize any shape, because as I said before, in the previous video, that option has to be activated before you start typing. So you can't apply it retrospectively. So we go OK, and then we can digitize our line. And enter. And we get this effect. So the hello looks fine. It's curving around nicely, but now the world is overlapping. The letters are overlapping. Let's zoom in. So that's not very satisfactory. So again, we can go to the reshape tool. Now you could change the curve so it's not as abrupt, but we can also move those letters around a little bit and they'll slide around the curve. That's not too bad. I don't like this big space between the R and the L. There is something we can do about that, but I'll come back to that. Okay, so that's your little pink diamond. It selects each individual letter. Let's go back to Hello World, and we're in the reshape tool. And let's look at some of the other tools here. Well, obviously you've got a baseline, and now that has a yellow node here, so you can extend that baseline and you can change the angle of it. So if I move it down here, it will change the angle of the writing. I'll undo that. I can extend it out, but really there's no point because it will just shrink back to the size of the lettering. Then there are some arrows here. Now these will change the size. The forward arrow will stretch the lettering out. So let's get the whole word on the page and let's grab that forward arrow and stretch it out. And you can see that the width is changing. So that has spread the whole writing out. You may want to do that for some reason. I'll undo that. And the top arrow is going to change the height. So you can actually change the height and the width proportionately. So you can change that size. Just be careful when you're doing it to read what actual height and width it is, because remember you want to stay within that range that is acceptable for that font. So that's probably a little bit too big, so I'll undo that one. If I zoom in here, no, that's okay. There's also an up arrow somewhere halfway along. You will have to look for it. These symbols are very tiny, but if you know they exist, you can look for them. So this is the up arrow. So I've got a forward arrow to stretch it widthways, a forward diagonal arrow to switch to scale it proportionately, and we've got an up arrow to scale just the height, which gives you another effect there. Okay, I'll undo that and I'll undo again to get it back to a reasonable size. So those tools operate on the whole object, the up arrow, the forward arrow, and the diagonal arrow. And the pink diamonds actually can then select an individual letter. So let's zoom into the W, select the pink diamond, it'll turn blue, and I accidentally moved it a bit, so we'll put it back. It has some tools of its own too, which you have to search for as well. The one that's probably the easiest to find is this one down here, which is a circle tool, a circle icon type thing. And if you grab that, it can rotate the letter. And when you rotate the letter, you might be able to find the other tools more easily. These are sort of hollow tools. They're a little bit different. They're double-headed arrows rather than single arrows. Probably that's the best way to describe it. So there is also an up arrow to change the height, a diagonal arrow to change the letter proportionately, and a sideways arrow to change the width. So you can actually change one letter in relation to all the others. Let's rotate that back down so it's sitting on the line again. So if you want one really large letter, you can organise that compared to the rest of the writing. Down here, if I select the Hello World, that L that I wasn't happy with, I can select that, get the rotation handle and just rotate that a little bit and move it. Whoops, I need to grab that pink arrow, move it back this way a little bit. And I think that looks better on that curve. So that's how useful those individual letter tools can be to perfecting your layout. I'm actually not too happy about the gap between the W and the O, so I'll just grab the W and move that along a little bit. It looks better. There is a bigger gap now between the two words, but I'd rather that than the gap between the W and the O. So sometimes there's a compromise, otherwise you have to move every individual letter of a whole word. Now, what if you wanted to have two different fonts for each word? You could enter them as two separate words and then align them so they were on the same line, but you can actually break apart a lettering object. So let's go to individual objects, and you can see I've got two lettering objects now, the Hello World on the curved line and the Hello World on the straight line. Let's pick the one on the straight line, and I'm going to select it and I'm going to move it a bit further away so I've got more action too. more room to look at it. Okay, let's zoom into that. Okay, so I can now, while it's selected, go to the Edit toolbox and click on the word Break Apart. And that will break it into 2 separate words. So now I can do whatever I want to this word. I can right click on it, go to the object properties, I can change the font and apply that. I can move that as an individual lettering object anywhere on the screen. I can do all the things you can do with an object, such as rotate or size here, but I can also go to the reshape tool in the lettering object and do all of those, use any of those tools I've shown you already. So you can adjust everything for each individual word. Now, what if you wanted a different font just for the first letter of a word? So let's close that for a minute and close that little notice from Bernina, and let's pick the word world. So we'll select that, and I want to just change the W to a different font. So I'm going to break apart the word into individual letters. So again, I select it and I go to my Edit toolbox and come down to Break Apart. And now you can see that I've got individual letters. So I can change that W by going to the Object Properties, and I can choose a different font just for that W. Let me see, what will I choose? I could even do the Phoebe Curls and apply. Okay, get that. So as you can see, you can make quite a nice lettering object at the beginning of a sentence just by breaking apart and changing the font for the W, rather than having to type the font in, the W in, as a single letter and align it with the other half of the word. This is a much better option to use the break apart tool. Now, of course, these are individual objects, so you don't want to accidentally move any of them either. Be careful. Now, if you have a whole sentence, your break apart works backwards like this. So I'm just going to get a new design so that I can, I'll just take the grid off, so that I can put a sentence in. So let's go to our lettering and let's type in hello world again. I'll put a return. How are you? Question mark. Return. Hope all is well. Whoops. Right. So now I'm going to go OK and pop that in, and here we are with 3 lines of text, and it's all one object. So I can use my normal scaling, but it will scale every line together. If I go to the reshape tool, I can scale with the reshape, and I can select each individual letter just like I could before. If I want to work with just one line though, I will have to break it apart. So as I said, it works backwards. So whatever you've got, it will go one step back. I think of it as backwards anyway. So the first step when you've got more than one line, when you break apart, is Edit, Break Apart, is you will get separate lines. So you can see that in your colour film, you'll see that happen. Hello world, how are you? Hope all is well. Then if you want to just work with the middle line and change that to italic, for instance, let's see if that will work. So we'll go to Object Properties, and there's an italic in there. So let's put the angle at, say, 5 or 7 degrees and apply. And you can see, oh, I'll have to increase it a bit more so it's more obvious, but let's go 10 and apply. Okay, so I've now applied italics to just that line. I can also, now that I've got a separate line, I could make that one line a different colour. I could also make it a different fill, but I'm going to talk about fills in a little while, so we'll leave that for now. But you don't have to stay with the satin fill of the default satin fill for the lettering. Okay, so that broke apart the individual lines into separate lines, and then you can go ahead and let's select the first line. You can break apart again, which will break it into the individual words, but only on that line. So if you want to break the third line into individual words, you'll have to select that line and break it apart. And then, of course, your individual words can break apart into the individual letters. There is one more break apart, so let's break. We've broken this apart into a word, so let's break it apart into individual letters. And you can see here we've got the individual letters, and so let's choose the W and let's break that apart. What happens when you break apart an individual letter? It no longer is a letter. It's now embroidery objects. So all the little objects that make up that letter are separate embroidery objects. It's a W. So that's the first one. Let's go out of true view. And so that's the first part. Then this part sews. Then this part, and I can use my tab button actually. Then this part, then the bottom, then that. So you can actually really get down to the nitty-gritty of editing if there's something wrong with the letter. This can happen when you get a true type font, and most of it's okay, but you might get one letter that's a bit wonky. Then you might want to go in and actually edit the objects. So you have got that option. Of course, you can't go back and make it a lettering object again, so you need to get your layout right and everything else right before you start fiddling with the individual letters, because then the only way to keep it all as one, it would be to group sections of it, but it would not turn back into a lettering object. All right, let's talk about fills. So let's go to the hope all is well, the word hope. Okay, so when you've got a lettering object, you can change the fill. It doesn't have to be satin. The most obvious one is the step fill. Let's go to true view so you can see that. So now this is a step fill. I'm not sure I like it on the curve so much because it's actually angled. Because this is still a lettering object, it has retained its angles from the lettering. So if I go to the reshape tool, you can't actually see the angles in the reshape tool for lettering, but let's go to the word. Let's make, which one did we make? I think we made the W, individual objects, yes. So if I want to change the W to a fill, I can actually, oh, I'd rather do an O. Let's choose the O and let's break that apart, because at the moment it's still a lettering object because it's the letter O. Let's break it apart, and now it's actually an embroidery object. If I change the fill to a step fill, let's select it, change it to a step fill, we've got all these funny angles. But because it's now an embroidery object, I can actually remove the stitch angles in version 9 Designer Plus, which will put it all at a 45-degree angle, and then I can change the angle. So, or I can add stitch angles. So you can do all the things with this lettering. Let me just change the angle to horizontal. So I'll go to reshape. You can do all the things with, once you've broken apart to an embroidery object, you can use all the tools that you can use with embroidery objects. I'm not sure I like that either. So the step fill might not be your favourite one for curvy type letters. It doesn't work too bad on up and down letters, but it can be useful if you actually want to make a really big letter. So let's choose this H, which is still part of the word. So let's break that apart as if we just typed an H in. Okay, so you might want to make an H that's really big. So I'll now break that apart again. Well, actually, no, I can do it here, can't I? Because I've got the scale proportionally tool here. So I could make a really big H, and I'm not restricted to the size anymore because my fill stitch is now a step fill. Obviously, you don't want to make it too big, but you've got more options if you're not using a satin stitch. Satin stitch can be problematic when you get to big objects. So I'll select that and I'll move that over here. Whoops, not that. This. Move that over here. So you can change the fill while you're still in lettering mode. So this is still a lettering object and I can change the fill, but you are restricted. So you've got step fill, satin, raised satin. You've got fancy fill, which can be fun. Let's choose the O, and I'll just make that bigger so you can see too. Oh, is that an embroidery object or a lettering object? It's a lettering object. Okay. So this O is a lettering object still. I haven't broken it back into an embroidery object. So I'm restricted on my fills, but I can apply the sculptured fancy fill for this one, which will curve the fancy fill around the shape, as opposed to standard fancy fill, which will look like this. So I'll just zoom in a bit more so you can see. So this is normal fancy fill with the default fancy fill. You can change it to any of the different fancy fills you like. Let's choose a different one. So you could even put the letter O in, but I won't. I'll do it. What's the Picasso like? That's not bad. Let's try that one. And apply. And actually I'll go OK. So that's got that fancy fill in it now, and I could go to sculptured fancy fill and it will give a different look again. So it might be the same one I started with. Let's go to the object properties. Oh, that's the glitter one again. We can go to which one did I choose? Spiral? Don't know. Yes, I think it was. Oh, let's choose spiral and go OK. And let's choose that's just ordinary fancy fill. If we go to spiral again, with the sculptured fancy fill icon this time, or spirale, there we go, but we've got sculpture fancy fill icon here. You can also apply it here as well, so you can see what it looks like, and go OK. And there's our spiral. You can see the spirals are bigger here on the wider parts. They're squashed in more here, and they actually come around in a curve. It's a little funny bit there where they overlap, so you have to play around with those fills. But as I said, they're the options you have. You can't use a ripple fill or lacework fills or pattern fill. I know that the creator level of software doesn't even have a lot of these fills. But if you break your letter apart into embroidery objects, so let's choose the P. I'm going to drag the P over here and zoom in and make that bigger. Okay, select it again. And I'm going to break that apart into embroidery objects. For those of you with Designer Plus, once it's embroidery objects, you can then apply the different fills. So if I wanted to apply the blackwork fill settings, I could select a part of the object. You're going to have to do it for every individual part. So blackwork fill on there and blackwork fill on there. Probably not the best fill. Let's try the lacework fill. Because the letter's so small, that doesn't look so good either. Let's try our pattern fill. Depending on the pattern and how big your letter is, of course, So you can have different fills for each part of the letter. You could even do a candlewick fill. So if you want really interesting fills, you will need to break the letter apart into an embroidery object, and it will be separate parts of the object. The only other way to do it would be to weld the two together. Now, I don't know if I can do that. Let me see. Yes, let's weld those two together. Now it's all one object, and I can fill it with the candle wicking. Now, weld, I don't believe. Let's check the creator level. I'll go and check that and come back. Okay, so here I am in the creator level of software, and yes, you do have the weld tool. You don't have as many fills, but you do have the pattern fill. Now, let me just go back here. I don't think we could apply the pattern fill to a lettering object. Let me find a lettering object. Here's the A, here's a lettering object. Well, that's still a whole word. And yes, the pattern fill is greyed out. So if you want to use a pattern fill, so you won't have candle wicking, so I'll change this to a pattern fill now. Well, let's choose I'm going to choose the A. So I need to break that apart. I always think the break apart's in the pop-up menu. I don't know why. So let me select the line, break it apart into individual words, select the word R, break that apart again into individual letters, select the A, and as you can see, it's still a letter, so I cannot, let me put my colour fill out. I cannot there you go. I cannot apply the pattern fill to that. So I'll bring it out here. I'll make it bigger. And as you can see, this is really not a good size with satin stitch. But I can apply a step fill. I can apply raised satin, which wouldn't be any good either. Or I can break this apart again. And now it's individual objects, and now I'm going to weld them together. So in your edit toolbox there is a weld tool, so you'll need to select both objects so that it can weld. Don't worry about the fact that you've got long satin stitches now, because we're going to change it to a pattern fill. And there we have quite a weird pattern fill, and I think that's because we need to remove the stitch angles. Okay, so here I am back at the letter A, where it is broken apart into embroidery objects, but I've still got these different angles. So once you've broken it apart into the embroidery objects, you need to select each one and remove the stitch angles. So I'm selecting this one here and removing the stitch angles. So now I've got the default 45-degree angle, and I'll do the same to that part. Remove the stitch angles, and now select both parts and weld. And now they're all at 45-degree angles, so we can now apply the pattern fill. So I'll just apply the default. So you can get some really pretty effects. You could put an outline around this with the outlines and offsets tool. So I'm going to select that. Let me select, oh yes, I had the A selected, I'm sure. So let's select a satin line and the colour red. You can't tick the include holes in just the outline, but I think it will include the hole. I'm just not going to worry too much about this because I haven't got overlapping objects. I'm just going to go OK, making sure I haven't got a tick in the offset outlines, and go OK. And there I have a nice satin outline around my letter A. So let's have a quick look at that in true view. Looks much nicer, of course. So you can see there is a lot you can do with lettering. You don't have to stick to just the basic old fonts. You can be creative. Hopefully I've given you enough information so you can play for a while, but if you have any questions, please put them in the comments below and I'll try to address them all. Also, if you have any other lettering techniques you're trying to do and don't know how, put that down below, because this subject is quite endless and I'd be happy to put them on my list of things to do to show you and answer your questions. So make sure you're subscribed and you've checked the notifications bell to make sure you get notified when I put up new videos, and enjoy your digitizing. Thank you very much.